Hello, everyone. Can you hear me well? Yes? Great. Okay. All right, my name is Craig Turner. I am a writer, also a business owner in Northern Virginia, and former journalist. I used to cover Congress, live in Northern Virginia. So I want to first say that packing for this trip here, to be a speaker, one of my obvious questions is what kind of clothes do I wear? And so I'm confused by this, and I start packing all sorts of different options, thinking to myself, well, I'll just see what the other speakers are wearing, because that way I'll just follow the trend. Well, every other speaker before me was a priest, so what do you do with that? So I actually have some good colors on here, though, because black, of course, represents death to the world. That's why the priests wear black, because they are not to allow all the different temptations of the world to affect them. And then, of course, we have blue for Mary. So this is the colors, I think, for the shrine. That should be the colors for the shrine. So before I start, my topic actually is the martyrs of North America. And there's no way that I'm going to be able to do them justice because the topic is too grand. And you can't really, every time you use words, you water down what it is. It's the grandeur of some kind of event. But first, I need to mention that Father Justin had talked about, during the homily, going around in the pickup truck and blessing New Rochelle during the lockdown. And I actually had 3 visions of this exact event, and I didn't know when I had these 3 visions that it was him, and I didn't even think I would ever know in my lifetime who it was I was seeing. But back in Northern Virginia, 3 different times, separated about a week apart, I had a vision of a man who was in a pickup truck, and he was strapped to hold him steady, either by ropes or by bungee cords, and he had a monstrance, and he was going around a city, blessing the city with prayers and exorcism prayers, exactly what he described. So I thank you, Father Justin, for doing that. That's a beautiful thing. So we have 8 martyrs that we're going to cover. It's difficult because we're going to have to deal with 8 different biographies, and they intersect and they move around, and so for a period of 2 months, I'm writing and rewriting this script, trying to figure out how do I tell this story without everybody being confused. But I think I've got it down now, and I think you're going to like it. The 3 martyrs that we deal with here at this shrine are St. Isaac Jogues. He was a priest. Here's Isaac Jogues right here. And then René Goupil, he's over here. He was a donné. A donné was a lay person who was not a priest. And then St. John de Lalande, who was a lay brother as well, not a priest. And then 5 other missionaries, Jesuit missionaries, were martyred in Canada, and all of them were priests. St. John de Brebeuf, St. Anthony Daniel, St. Charles Garnier, St. Noel Chabanel, and St. Gabriel Lalemant. So this story actually begins with the arrival of the French in Canada in 1534. And they had started with bringing in permanent settlements. And then the tribes in this area basically were dealing with a number of different Indian tribes that they were going to, the Franciscans who came in first to evangelize were going to try to convert and bring the gospel to them. In the north, we had the Algonquin Indians and the Huron Indians, and then the Iroquois Nation, which was essentially 6 different tribes that included the Mohawk Indians and other tribes. They controlled the land south of the Great Lakes. When the French came in, they saw, the French sailors saw this giant rock face and said, "What a rock," which was Quebec, and that's how Quebec got its name, supposedly. Anyway, the Franciscans were evangelizing for quite some time. They evangelized for 10 years, but they had almost no success. They were having a real trouble with the Indians. And what happened is, in 1624, they petitioned back in France the Jesuits to come and help them. So 3 Jesuits a year later, this would be 10 years after the Franciscans had arrived, showed up on their shores, and one of them was the 32-year-old John de Brebeuf. He was a big, husky, towering figure of a man. Think of a lineman on a pro football team, big bearded man. He was towering. He towered over everybody, including the Indians. He was as strong as an ox, but he was considered to be extremely gentle, and he was a very humble man. So he was our first of the various people that will follow. He had gone off, and even though he had a great education as a Jesuit, many, many years of studying to become a Jesuit, he had volunteered to go to New France, which is what Canada was called at the time, and evangelize and simply live among the Indians. So the Algonquin Indians were a very large tribe. They were more nomadic. They moved around. They didn't really have permanent settlements. And the Jesuits and the Franciscans decided they weren't going to try evangelizing them first. It was going to be more difficult than the Indians that had permanent settlements. The Huron Indians had permanent, well-fortified settlements, and it seemed that they were going to be the right group to evangelize. Father Brebeuf was sent to establish a mission in the midst of the Huron tribes. To get there, he joined a trading party heading back to the Huron from Quebec City, and over a period of a month, traveled 900 miles across the Ottawa River, Lake Nipissing, and the French River, as well as other waterways in between. So I'm the only one here probably today who has ever had the opportunity to live and travel like these missionaries did, because I spent 2 different summers in the 1980s in Algonquin Park, north of Toronto, where the Algonquin Indians lived, and worked as a canoe guide. I was stationed at a camp in the center of the park, and then we would take 3-day to 10-day trips, we called it tripping, through the park with campers, and we would carry everything with us, and we actually traveled in canoes that look almost identical to the canoe if you go into visit the museum and see a canoe hanging from the ceiling. It was almost identical to that. So I can tell you that the mode of travel was extremely difficult. I went from a husky, 180-pound young man from Houston to 159 pounds in the first 2 weeks. It was burning calories off my body so fast that I couldn't put them on. And we went from, in these various different ways, traveling around through the park. The park itself is 3,000 square miles, so there was tons of land to cover. But it was a fabulous summer. The very beginning, tried to quit. I had to try to figure out a way to get out of this job because I hated it so much. I thought this stinks. They're only going to pay me $200 for the entire summer doing this? Are you kidding me? And but in the end, what happened was I started to kind of like it, because I got used to getting rained on when it was raining and everything else. The second half of the first summer was fabulous. I traversed pristine lakes in this wooden canoe, carried our goods and everything that we had to eat with us, and we would lie down at night underneath a blanket of stars that dazzled the eyes and the imagination. We saw the most spectacular display of Aurora Borealis one night while in canoes out on Cache Lake, deep within the park, paddled up next to moose as they lazily grazed on tall grass at the edges of lakes, shot rapids down the Petawawa River, and heard the howls of a pack of timber wolves late one night as the moon rose over the hills. It was fantastic. Now, our Jesuit missionaries who traveled the same way, it was very, very difficult. They probably experienced many of these wonders and these beautiful sights and everything else, but at the same time, their work was a lot more difficult than me being just simply a canoe guide. After Brebeuf had arrived among the Huron Indians, he soon learned that his efforts were going to be quite difficult. The Huron Indians lacked a written language, and their words were uttered gutturally, without the use of lips, making the understanding of their words nearly impossible. In addition, they had no words to describe abstract thoughts. This meant that descriptions of non-material things would be very difficult. That was going to be a real challenge. The Franciscans had already begun creating a written language for these Indians, and they had a good start. But Brebeuf decided that he would continue their work. So here's his description that he wrote back to France in a report about how he catechized. We began our catechizing by this memorable truth, that their souls, which are immortal, all go after death either to paradise or to hell. I added that they had the choice during life to participate after death in one or the other, which one they ought to now consider. Whereupon one honest old man said to me, "Let him who will go to the fires of hell. I want to go to heaven." All the others followed, making use of the same answer, and begged us to show them the way. So it's important to note that his progress in evangelizing at the beginning was still very, very slow, just like the Franciscans. Yeah. 1635, he had only made 14 converts. By the end of the next year, he said he had made 86. Well, 86 is fabulous if you think about it. Each one of us hopefully would have at least one person that we can name in our lives that we evangelized well enough that they either came into the faith or came back to the faith. So though the travel was very difficult, was similar to how I described, and there are these beautiful, you're in a pristine environment. The lifestyle of the Huron Indians and all of the Indians of this region, of all of North America, it was difficult for them to live because the lifestyle was so dramatically different. It was extremely harsh living, and compared to the more refined European culture, it seemed to be lacking for them in decency and propriety. I don't mean this in any way to sound disrespectful or insolent, and of course we're looking backwards by 350 years, but the letters and writings of the missionaries sent back to France and the known history of Indian society show that there was a clash of cultures. The Indians practiced ritual torture, particularly of captives during war, the execution of prisoners, and at times they engaged in cannibalism. There were sexual excesses of every kind. The Indians held orgies. Men often traded wives or won or lost them in bets. And sexual profligacy was commonplace. In addition, hygiene and cleanliness were also lacking. There was defecation that occurred within the longhouses where they lived. That created terrible foul odors. In the heat of the summer, they felt it was almost impossible to live inside them. There were debauched festivals and more. So we look back on the Indians, and there's so many things that we love about the Indian culture, and at the same time there were things that obviously we wouldn't admire anymore. Brebeuf remained among the Huron Indians for a number of years, and then there was a war that broke out between England and France, and at that point in time he was required to go back home to France. While he's in France in 1636, he's telling his stories of survival in the woods of New France, and he's got a captivated audience, and Father Isaac Yogues is in the audience. And he hears these stories, and he says, "I want to go with you." He is excited to go evangelize. Father Yogues is 29 years old at the time. He's young, he's hardy, and he immediately joins Brebeuf on his trip back to New France. Also recruited at this time is Father Charles Garnier. Father Garnier was from a wealthy Paris family, but even though he came from high society, he requested to become a missionary to the wilds of New France. His wealthy father opposed his desires and blocked his efforts to go. But he persevered and received a mission assignment in New France among the Huron Indians. His work would bear much fruit, and a decade later, in 1647, he would found 2 missions after the Native Americans had become less hostile to what the Jesuits were doing. Brebeuf returned again to New France with Yogues and Garnier, as well as Father Anthony Daniel. Father Daniel had studied law before entering the Jesuits, was intelligent, faith-filled, zealous, and humble. Now here's a man, obviously, who's got some brains. He's a lawyer. He's had many years of theology with the Jesuits. There's many reasons for him to be a city boy and continue his work, but he just felt a calling to go, and he joined up. So it was Brebeuf, Father Yogues, Garnier, and Anthony Daniel who all arrive at the mission post, which is named St. Joseph. And they worked tirelessly there, learning the new language of the Native Americans, and spent hours learning their customs and sharing with them the gospel. Shortly after their arrival at St. Joseph, an illness passes through the camp. The Indians blame them for this illness. Well, in retrospect, we know that the Europeans had a greater immunity to certain illnesses like smallpox that the American Indians, the Native Americans, didn't have. But their interpretation of this was that they must be sorcerers. Well, they weren't sorcerers; they were missionaries. The Indians had great suspicion about the black robes, as they were called, and it caused a number of problems. But over time, they were okay with it, and it didn't completely fracture their relationship with the Indians. Their missionary efforts at first were unsuccessful, but then there was some progress being made by 1637. A prominent Huron chief, his name was Sayawendaantaha, formally renounced all immoral behaviors and superstitious practices and asked to be received into the Catholic faith. In June, he was baptized, and he was given the name Peter. Many of the Indians thought that as soon as he was baptized, he would fall over dead because the sorcerers were going to try to kill each one of them. But once they found out that he was perfectly okay, they said, maybe what the black robes are telling us could be true. Also, 2 months later, a young chief, he was about 35 years old, his name was Chiwatenwaha, and he was baptized and received into the faith as well and given the name Joseph. Prior to his conversion, the Jesuits were surprised to find that this man, living among the Indians that engaged in polygamy, orgies, and other practices, was living chastely with one wife and separating himself from the objectionable practices of the Huron. Both men took their new faith very seriously and became the edification of the Huron Indians. So there was this clash of cultures, and one of the practices of the Indians, the Huron Indians, and probably the other Indian tribes as well, was a thing called a death feast. This was a macabre party that they held in which they brought in a person who was going to be executed or for whatever reason was going to be killed, and they would hold a large feast. All the Indians would celebrate. They would sing songs about the terrible tortures that they would commit against this person, and then at the end of the death feast, they would kill the person. It was just really an awful practice. Brebeuf finds out that they're going to hold a death feast for him. So in order to try to figure out a way out of this, first, he begins a novena to St. Joseph, and then second, he decides he's going to invite them to his own death feast. So he creates this party. He tells them he's going to have a death feast. All the Indians come. It's standing room only. They're crowded in there. And he begins to sing a song that tells in Huron. He's learned enough Huron at this point to be able to sing a song in Huron or in Iroquois language in order to tell them that what he's going to be doing is all those people who live lives of sin go to the fires of hell, and those who accept the gospel and live lives of chastity and morality will go to a paradise where they will spend eternity. So he sings this song, they take note, and after a period of time, they begin to believe, okay, maybe what he's telling us is right. He finishes his song. They say, well, I guess what we should do is skip the death feast for him. They leave, and there's a relative peace there in the camp. In fact, the Indians, by the time they finish the novena to St. Joseph, the Indians themselves say, we have noticed there is a bit tangible peace here in our camp. So that worked out extremely well. Following this memorable episode, various Huron chiefs began inviting the Jesuits to meetings solely to discuss the elements of religion. They wanted private instruction, which they were given, and this began to energize the camp and the Hurons themselves. So I want to mention there are two different, one is a very famous story of evangelization in the Americas, in North America. Everybody here knows the story of Our Lady of Guadalupe. 1531, she appears 4 times to Juan Diego, 1 time to her uncle, and she begins this massive, what the Franciscans themselves were unable to do, and the missionaries in Mexico were unable to do. Suddenly, the place is set on fire, and there are 9 million conversions in a period of about 8 years. It was the greatest, actually, it's the biggest conversion of any group of people to any religion in history. It's an amazing story, truly an amazing story. The other story, probably a little bit less well-known, is a man named CABEZA de VACA. He was a Spaniard who came over, was going to actually set up a an outpost in Mexico, and he was going to be, he was second in command and was going to not necessarily evangelize, even though the Spaniards were Catholic. They were going to, it was something for the king, and it was more business related than anything else. He goes and they get woefully lost, and he ends up enslaved by the Indians of Texas, and for 7 years he lives among the Indians, but in the end he ends up with this amazing gift of healing. And it happens this way. One of the tribe that he is enslaved by, has somebody who's deathly ill, and they say to him, heal our sick person here. This person is at death's door. And CABEZA de VACA says, I've got no gift of healing, and I'm not a doctor, I can't help you. And they threaten to abuse the 4 of them, because there's 4 alive at this point in time, and withhold food and starve them to death if they don't do it. So they comply. CABEZA de VACA goes over to this person. He prays over the person. He breathes on them. Of course, ruah is the word for breath and for spirit. So when you see the priest at Mass, there's a reason they tilt the chalice toward their mouth, because breath and spirit are one, okay? He breathes over the sick person, and then he uses his thumb and he makes the sign of the cross, and he says, Our Father and a Hail Mary. And with that, the person was cured. And the Indians were kind of surprised. CABEZA de VACA was very surprised. And they lead them off to these other people, and they begin healing. They have a healing ministry throughout the tribes of Texas, and this goes on for a long time. And they have such an amazing gift of healing that they even raise a person from the dead, and there's many more miracles, many more stories to go with this. If you want to hear the entire 1-hour story, I wrote a talk for Lighthouse Catholic Media, and it is on the internet. You can download it as an audio download and listen to the story. So these 2 stories are truly amazing. In 1642, supplies for our Jesuit missionaries are running low. Brebeuf sends some Frenchmen, 5 Frenchmen and 18 Huron Indians back to Quebec for provisions. Among the Frenchmen was Isaac Jogues. The trip was dangerous and difficult. It was down rivers, and it was portaging through dense forests. But a month later, they arrived safely in Quebec City. While in Quebec, Isaac Jogues enters the local hospital to find supplies for their camp, and he meets René Goupil. You can see his picture up here, or his statue. He was a layperson. He was not a priest. He was a layperson, but he was asked to come and help the Jesuit missionaries, and he agrees. Goupil was the same age as Isaac Jogues, and he had been in the Jesuit novitiate at one point in time, but because of health reasons, he wasn't able to continue, so he had to leave. So on the return trip, there were 35 Hurons led by Chief Ahatsisari, a convert to the faith. The first day of their return trip went well, but on the second day, they hear musket fire and war cries that fill the air. These are Mohawk Indians. Mohawk Indians are one of the 6 tribes of the Iroquois Nation. All of the Iroquois nations are very ferocious. The Huron Indians and the Algonquin Indians were terrified whenever they encountered the Iroquois. And so hiding behind tall grass was this band of Iroquois who fired musket shots and arrows at the Huron and the French. The surprise attack was terrifying. Arrows penetrated the water and lanced the sides of the canoes. Musket balls whistled past them, and they quickly turned and paddled furiously for shore to take cover. Father Jogues' canoe landed on shore, and he leaps out into tall grass, hiding from the Mohawk Indians. A handful of Huron braves fights in hand-to-hand combat against twice as many Mohawk Indians, until suddenly 7 more canoes of Mohawks carrying 40 Indians lands nearby. The Huron were clearly overwhelmed. Jogues knew that his party would be taken captive, and wishing to assist them as best as possible, he stands up in the grass, he waves his arms, and he cries out words of surrender. He's apprehended by the opposing party of Indians, summarily beaten, and then taken as prisoner. Several days later, the 21 captives arrive at an island in Lake Champlain in northeastern New York. This is where many people hear the story of them having to running the gauntlet. They arrive on the shores. They have to go up this steep hill to get to the top, and all the Indian braves stand on either side with clubs and knives, and they have to run to get to the top while they get beaten along the way. This is what happens. Isaac Yogues is the last one to go up the hill. Only some of them actually make it all the way up. Isaac Yogues is he is unconscious before he even reaches the end, and he's dragged the rest of the way. The remainder of the tortures that these poor prisoners endured, I won't describe. It's safe to say that their torments are among the worst ever recorded or endured by saints. The Mohawks then decided to parade the prisoners before the entire Iroquois nation. The captives began a 2.5-week march through swamps, forests, and rivers, knowing that they would not survive. Yogues told Goupil that he could help him escape, but Goupil refused, saying, "Allow me to die with you, my father, for I cannot desert you." Goupil then asked for the chance to accept perpetual vows as a religious. That was denied to him earlier in life because of health reasons, and Yogues agrees, performing a consecration ceremony and elevating him to the title of a religious there in the woods of northern New York. Along the way, some of the Huron Indians who are captives of the Iroquois and almost certainly sentenced to death request baptism. These baptisms were the great consolation in the midst of great suffering for the missionaries. After 18 days, the prisoners reached the Mohawk village of Ossernenon, which is where we are now, AURIESVILLE, New York. The tortures continued here as well. One by one, the captives are put to death, but Chief Ahatsatsari, the convert, is sentenced to die in another village, and he's moved. People who were witnesses said that his final hours in the other village, they saw him continuously praying aloud for his persecutors, and then finally he's put to death. Yogues and Goupil survive. The tortures are intentionally not put to death because the Mohawk know that they hold prized possessions, humans that would fetch great sums from the French in ransom, such as muskets, gunpowder, and knives. Both men were devastated emotionally after having witnessed their Indian friends being put to death. Physically, they're not in much better shape. The recuperation was slow after their death march, but within several weeks, both were able to walk again. They were given liberty to walk around and make their way through camp as long as they did not try to escape. One day, several weeks later, Goupil was seen making the sign of the cross over the grandchild of an old warrior. You'll see an artwork of him with a little child, and sometimes he's actually making a sign of a cross, or else he's praying over a little child. This is a common image for Goupil. Both Yogues and Goupil had walked outside the village one evening to pray the rosary. This is what happened with Goupil because he's about to be martyred. After they prayed the rosary, they were returning, and two braves approached them. Yogues was ordered to continue walking, and just after he had turned and continued, a tomahawk was used against the back of René Goupil's head, killing him. It was the feast of St. Michael the Archangel, the 29th of September. Yogues was kept alive after the death of his friend and was allowed to continue recovering his health. We can only imagine the difficulty in this emotional recovery, which would have been more difficult than his physical recovery. After his physical recovery and during his captivity, he wandered through camp among the Mohawk Indians, entering longhouses in search of the sick for him to baptize or evangelize. During the next 13 months of his captivity, he was able to baptize 70 dying Mohawk. They were more interested when they were at death's door in baptism than when they were alive. I think that's actually common for a lot of people, everybody. He was chronically malnourished and so poorly clad, he nearly died of the cold. Yogues prayed so intensely during this time that he began to have visions. It also happened providentially that Yogues was away on a fishing expedition with some of the Indians when an Iroquois war party returned to camp after suffering a humiliating defeat from the French. He would have been killed instantly to appease their anger, but he wasn't there. In fact, Yogues found out that he had been sentenced to be killed as soon as he returned to the camp. The fishing party stopped at a Dutch settlement to trade, and the Dutch convinced him that his evangelization efforts would be more effective if he left the Mohawks for a time and then returned later. So during the night, as he pretended to sleep between two braves in a muddy hut, he slowly got up and, carefully stepping over one of the guards, made his way to the door of the hut where they were sleeping and then ran like crazy for freedom. A dog gnashed its teeth into his leg, injuring him, but he was able to get to safety. When the Mohawks discovered that their prize was gone, they were furious. Yogues found the owner of an old shop and was quickly given the attic in which to hide, recuperate, and to heal his injured leg. After many weeks of searching for their slave prisoner, the Mohawks finally gave up and returned to their camp. Yogues then was led to the East Coast, where he was the first priest actually, to step foot on Manhattan Island. Manhattan Island had been purchased only 17 years earlier from the Lenape Indians. They had paid 60 guilders, which would be $24 in trinkets and goods. $24 at that time was, in today's dollars, about $1,100. Still a pretty good deal, right? The land value today of Manhattan is $1.75 trillion. It's a lot of money. Nobody knew at the time that it was going to be worth that much, but the geology of Manhattan Island is unique, and it made for very tall buildings. People could build very, very tall buildings. It is the same amount of money as the gross domestic product of Canada every year. So the Indians thought they were getting a fabulous deal when they sold Manhattan Island. The guys who purchased it also thought they were getting a great deal. So Yogues lands on Manhattan Island. He's put on a sailing vessel for France. On Christmas Day, 1643, he arrives in a little fishing village near Brittany. A week later, he's in Rennes, where the College of the Jesuits is located, and he is still dressed in torn and shabby peasant's garb, limping and scarred. He knocks on the door of the college, knowing that the daily mass would soon begin. The porter who answers the door asks him suspiciously who he is. He says merely, "A poor man." After he indicates he had come from Canada, he's invited in, mainly so the porter could hear news of what was happening in New France. By the flickering light of a single candle in the early morning twilight, he was asked, "Is it true you have come from Canada?" "Yes," he says. "Do you know Father Brebeuf?" "Extremely well," he says. "And Father Yogues, do you know Father Yogues?" His voice begins to fill with emotion, and he says, trembling, "I knew him very well indeed." "Is he still alive? Have those barbarians not murdered him?" With his lower lip shaking and tears filling his eyes, Yogues replied, "He is at liberty. Reverend Father, it is he who speaks to you." There's an outcry of joy as the tattered and beaten missionary is welcomed into the College of Jesuits. Yogues stays there recuperating, and he becomes the topic of daily conversation in France. All of France is talking about this missionary priest. He's welcomed into high society. The Queen Regent of Austria receives him as an honored guest. Father Yogues is given special permission by Pope Urban VIII to say Mass, because canon law at the time did not allow priests to say Mass holding the host with any other fingers except the index finger and the thumb. He was so badly mutilated, he was missing those fingers. The Pope had said, "It is unbefitting that a martyr of Christ should not drink the blood of Christ." So he begins his recuperation there, but he's unflattered by all this attention. All he really wants to do is go back to New France and continue his work evangelizing the Native Americans. He's finally given permission to go back, and the night before his departure, he says, "I go, but I shall never come back again." He crosses the Atlantic Ocean, returns for a short time to Quebec, and then makes another foray in September of 1646 to the Mohawk Indians. With him is a young layperson named John de Lalande. Like Goupil, Lalande was a donne, a layperson. Lalande was only 19 years old when he arrived in New France, but by this point in time, he's probably about 23 years old. The situation has changed a lot. There had been a peace treaty that the French wanted to establish among the Indians. It was signed actually by the French, the Mohawks, all the Iroquois Nation, the Hurons, and the Algonquin Indians. This was going to allow traders and everybody else who wanted to pass freely through these territories. Yogues his desire was to take this fledgling peace treaty and help it grow into something more substantial. So when he returns to the Mohawk Indians where Goupil had been murdered, he was an envoy from the government of New France. Accompanying them into the wilderness were several Huron Indians, but the difficult and treacherous journey was so perilous and challenging even for the Huron that all but one Indian abandoned the trip. When Yogues and John de Lalande arrived at the Mohawk camp, they were greeted cordially but with some suspicion. The Indians hold a council, there's singing, speeches, gifts are exchanged of belts of wampum and furs. The council ends well, and Father Yogues was able to administer the sacraments to Christian Indian captives, as well as to baptize the Indians who were dying and willing to receive the sacrament. However, some young braves, a more radical faction among the greater Mohawk tribe, were secretly less than enthusiastic about the return of the black robes, mainly because the drought the previous summer had created more hardships. They thought Yogues' mass kit was the item that contained the sorcery. During his stay, Yogues was invited to a council among the braves in a separate longhouse from the one where he was staying. He couldn't really decline because that would be an insult, but to go probably meant that it was a trap. He decides he would go, and he agrees to go. When he enters the longhouse, he is hit with a tomahawk and then beheaded. When Lalande heard about the death of Father Isaac Yogues later that day, he goes to retrieve the body in order to bury it, but he suffers the same fate as Father Isaac Yogues. Both bodies were thrown into the Mohawk River. The year after Isaac Yogues died, 1647, the Mohawk brave who tomahawked him, killing him, was captured in a raid by natives who were allied with the French. He was sentenced to death, but the night before his execution, he requested baptism. He saw that the waters of rebirth were among the greatest gifts that a God of infinite mercy could bestow, and he wanted to experience this rebirth. When asked what baptismal name he wanted, he replied, Father Isaac Yogues. He was baptized with this name and then put to death. Meanwhile, there's another missionary. He's another martyr in our story. He arrives on the scene, the 31-year-old Jesuit named Father Noel Chabanel. Chabanel had entered the Jesuit novitiate in Toulouse, France at the age of 17 and had become a professor. His desire was to be a missionary, so in 1643, he was sent to New France. He was very refined and found it very, very difficult to be among the Indians and the culture that he was experiencing there. But he made a private vow that he would not leave, so that he didn't quit and he wouldn't give up. Later, he was sent in the fall of 1649 to aid Father Garnier. Chabanel stayed with Garnier only a few weeks before Garnier realized the situation with the Iroquois was so dangerous he had to be sent back to mission headquarters. Chabanel left that location and spent 2 nights at a nearby mission, and then the following day set out with a party of Hurons on a very difficult trek through 18 miles of thick forest. That night in camp, the party was awakened by the sound of an Iroquois war party singing victory songs. They had captured some of the Jesuit missionaries and held them as captives. The Hurons decided to return immediately to the village they had left. Chabanel, though, couldn't keep up with their quick pace, and the following day, when traveling alone, he reached a river that was too deep to cross, the Nottawasaga. He waited there for someone with a canoe who might be able to help him. After a while, a Native American who had been a Christian at one point in time but had renounced his faith came along in a canoe and offered to carry him across. Part of the way across the river, he killed Chabanel with a hatchet, stole his possessions, and threw his body into the river. 2 years later, that same Indian admitted to what he had done and confessed that he had acted out of hatred for the missionaries. So in July of 1648, Father Anthony Daniel, the priest who had returned from France with Isaac Jogues and John de Brebeuf, was stationed at the missionary post called St. Joseph's. Huron braves who were ordinarily there protecting the village had left either to trade goods or to engage the Iroquois. Early one morning, a force of 600 Seneca Indians, the Seneca Indians were one of the 6 tribes of the Iroquois nation, ambushed the village and began shooting arrows and throwing tomahawks. Father Daniel had just finished saying Mass and ran out into the melee to help the Huron to escape. Crying out to the women and children, he said, "Flee, my children." And to gain them more time, he held high a crucifix, trying to march directly toward the Iroquois braves. But immediately a musket ball and several arrows pierced his body, and he hits the ground dead. He was scalped and then cannibalized. The Seneca Indians were hoping they could inherit the power of this black robe by consuming his flesh. Then they set fire to the chapel and threw his partially consumed and desecrated body into the inferno, burning it. The Seneca killed between 400 and 500 people and herded off nearly 700 prisoners, mainly women and children, into the forest. 9 months later, John de Brebeuf and Father Gabriel Lalemant would be martyred. They were stationed at a mission post called St. Mary that was suddenly attacked by the Iroquois and taken captive. Then they were put on a death march to the Iroquois home base. Brebeuf was 58 years old, and with Father Lalemant, they were tortured and then put to death, Brebeuf dying before Lalemant. The latter, Lalemant, was kept alive as long as possible during the night so that the Iroquois could offer him as a human sacrifice to their god. The sleeping sun god, Arescu, needed to rise the next day first in order to receive the sacrifice being made. Lalemant, who was young, strong, and fearless, was this sacrifice. The 2 bodies of Brebeuf and Lalemant were later recovered by the faithful and then given solemn burials at the St. Mary mission post. When asked once whether he would be afraid of being tortured with fire should he ever be captured, Brebeuf said, "Oh yes, I would fear it if I regarded only my weakness. The sting of a fly is capable of making me impatient, but I trust that God will help me. Aided by his grace, I do not fear the torments of fire any more than I fear the prick of a pin." So I end my account of the martyrs of North America with a happy conclusion. In the Christian life, with every death is a resurrection, and with every sorrow comes joy. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Not long after the death of these martyrs, only 7 years in fact, a young squaw was born near this shrine from the Mohawk tribe that had put to death some of the North American martyrs. Her name was Tekakwitha. Now, you could call her Tekakwitha. That's what I always called her name, but it seems that there's a little bit of a trend to call her Tekakwitha. Nobody really knows. Even the people who run the shrine here would say you could call her either one. This means she who bumps into things, and she would become the first Native American to be canonized a saint. She was not Christian growing up, but after she heard about the faith from 3 Jesuit missionaries at around age 11, her faith grew until she became convinced that this was the true path to God. She eventually converted, even though her father was a Mohawk chief, but she was shunned by her own tribe, harassed, stoned, and threatened with torture. And to save her own life, she fled 200 miles north to a place near Montreal. In the end, she became a great saint. At baptism, she chose the name Kateri, or Catherine, after Catherine of Siena, and even attended Mass twice a day. She was so hungry for the bread of immortality. Kateri Tekakwitha died at 3 p.m., the hour of great mercy, on Holy Wednesday, April 17th, 1680, at the age of 23 or 24. Her final words were, "Jesus, Mary, I love you." After her death, those present noticed a physical change in her body. Her face, pockmarked from the smallpox she had contracted as a 4-year-old girl, suddenly changed to radiant and beautiful about 15 minutes after her death, transfigured and visibly glowing according to those present. The smallpox disappeared, and only her transfigured face was visible. This face, wrote one of her biographers who was present at her death, so marked and swarthy, suddenly changed about a quarter of an hour after death and became in a moment so beautiful and so white, I observed it immediately. Tekakwitha appeared to 3 people in the weeks after her death: her mentor, Anastasia, her friend, Marie-Therese, and a Jesuit priest who guided her spiritually. The first, Anastasia, said that while crying over the death of her spiritual daughter, she looked up to see Kateri kneeling at the foot of her mattress, quote, holding a wooden cross that shone like the sun. The second, her friend Marie-Therese, reported that she was awakened at night by a knocking on her wall, and a voice asked if she was awake. "I have come to say goodbye," the voice said, adding, "I am on my way to heaven." Marie-Therese went outside to find the speaker, but saw no one. Then she heard the voice say, "Adieu, adieu, go tell the Father that I am going to heaven." The third, a Jesuit named Chachatier, saw Kateri at her grave. He said she appeared in Baroque splendor, meaning exquisite splendor. This was not a fleeting image or a momentary apparition. He stood there and watched her for 2 hours, saying he gazed upon her the entire time, awestruck in wonder, quote, her face lifted toward heaven as if in ecstasy. This extraordinary saint would continue to create great ripples through history for the glory of God after her death, even into our day. One of her miracles involves curing a young boy who contracted a flesh-eating bacteria. There was a mention of this yesterday. His name was Jake Finkbonner, and he was a young 5-year-old American boy playing basketball one season when a last-minute attempt to sink the basketball resulted in his face bumping the basketball hoop. A very nasty flesh-eating bacteria called necrotizing fasciitis began to eat his face and consume his flesh. Within 2 days, he was medevaced to a hospital in Seattle, and the situation shortly became critical. His lip, cheek, and forehead were being eaten by this bacteria, and no intervention by doctors was able to stop it. Finally, as his death failed and all attempts to stop the deadly progress of the virus exhausted, his family was told to prepare for death. His doctor said his case, quote, was beyond any medical intervention. The chief of plastic surgery at Seattle Children's Hospital said he had never seen a case so dire or severe. At one point, the disease was spreading at the rate of half an inch every hour across his body. His family and friends, along with others contacted through the internet, began to pray to Kateri Tekakwitha for a miracle cure. The reason she was selected for this miracle was that Jake was half Lumi Indian. Meanwhile, an extraordinary episode occurs. While he was in the hospital dying, Jake has a near-death experience. He rises up out of his body and exits the building. He can see the hospital from the air, and then he travels bodiless to heaven. He describes it as a beautiful experience, and while he was there, he said he decided he wanted to stay, not returning to his body. But God the Father tells him he has to return and that he would live. Meanwhile, a relic of the saintly body of Kateri Tekakwitha was placed on his pillow near his face. Immediately after the relic is placed on his pillow, the disease stops its progression and then disappears. The bacteria, necrotizing fasciitis, simply vanished. This miracle was the final miracle that was used by the Vatican to declare Kateri a saint. So I end this incredible miracle story and the stories of the 8 amazing Jesuit martyrs who gave their lives evangelizing the Indians of New York and Canada with this. The cannibalism practiced against some of the Jesuit missionaries by the Mohawk Indians prefigures the flesh-eating bacteria that was consuming the little boy who ironically was saved by a former Mohawk Indian. And Kateri, dying from smallpox at 4 years old, and left with a disfigured face, heals the 5-year-old boy who is dying from a flesh-eating bacteria that's consuming his face. She saves his life, this Indian woman who was seen at death transfigured in glory. May your life be as profound and beautiful as the lives of these saints, and may God bless you abundantly in your journey.